I've spent a lifetime watching people react to numbers, and I can tell you this. Most people don't fail because the numbers are against them. They fail because the numbers intimidate them into intellectual surrender. Mention something like the top 10% of net worth, and you can almost see it happen in real time. Eyes glaze over, shoulders relax in a strange way. Not relief, resignation. The conclusion forms instantly. That's not for me. And once that conclusion is reached, thinking stops completely. That reaction has always struck me as a little absurd. Not because the goal is trivial, it isn't, but because of how quickly people decide they are disqualified without ever bothering to understand what they're disqualifying themselves from. They don't ask what the number represents. They don't ask how people actually reach it. They don't ask whether the assumptions in their head are even remotely accurate. They just assume the answer is no, close the file, and move on with their lives. And that decision, made quietly, early, and without much thought, ends up shaping decades of behavior. Once you've decided something is impossible for you, it stops influencing your choices. You don't think about it when you take on debt. You don't consider it when your spending expands along with your income. You don't stop to ask whether today's decision moves you closer to anything meaningful or further away. Why would you? You've already concluded you're not playing that game. That's how people end up drifting. Not in one dramatic collapse, but in a long series of unexamined decisions that all make sense in isolation and look disastrous when viewed together. The irony is that the reality behind that intimidating number is far less dramatic than people imagine. Take the often cited figure for being in the top 10% of household net worth in the United States, roughly $1.8 million. For many people, that number alone ends the conversation. It sounds enormous. It sounds final. It sounds like something that must belong exclusively to hedge fund managers, lottery winners, or people who bought the right stock at exactly the right moment. But that reaction isn't rational. It's emotional. And it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what net worth actually is. Net worth is not liquidity. It is not the amount of money you could spend tomorrow if you felt like being reckless. It is not a pile of cash sitting neatly in an account waiting to be admired. Net worth is simply a balance sheet. What you own minus what you owe. That's it. No mystery, no glamour. It includes things people rarely get excited about: home equity, retirement accounts, slowly compounding investments, sometimes a small business built over decades. When people hear $1.8 million and imagine a checking account with 7 figures in it, they've already wandered off into fantasy. They're arguing with a picture that doesn't exist. Once you correct that mental image, the whole idea becomes much easier to grasp. If you drive through an ordinary middle to upper middle class neighborhood, not a gated enclave, not a distressed area, just a normal place where people work, raise families, and complain about property taxes, statistically, about 1 in 10 households there will meet that threshold. And you won't be able to tell which one it is. There won't be a sign in the yard. There won't be a uniform. There may not even be a particularly impressive car in the driveway. That's another illusion, people. Cling to the idea that wealth at that level must announce itself. In reality, net worth is remarkably quiet. It builds in places most people never look, and over timelines most people underestimate. A very typical picture looks something like this. A home purchased years ago, not at the peak of extravagance, but at a reasonable level for the area. Over time, the mortgage gets paid down and the property appreciates. Several $100,000 of net worth appears on paper without any dramatic effort, not because of brilliance, but because of patience. Alongside that, there's usually a retirement account. Not a heroic one, just consistent contributions, year after year, invested in a reasonably sensible way. Given enough time, Those contributions compound into numbers that surprise people who never bothered to run the math. $500,000 or more doesn't require genius, it requires persistence and time. Two things that are widely available and routinely squandered. Add in some savings, perhaps a taxable investment account, maybe a small business or a rental property if circumstances allowed, and suddenly the intimidating number looks far less mythical. It's not concentrated, it's not flashy, and most importantly, it doesn't feel dramatic from the inside. That's another uncomfortable truth people don't like to hear. Many households cross that top 10% threshold without ever feeling rich in the cinematic sense. Their lives don't suddenly transform into luxury. The wealth sits in the background, supporting stability, options, and resilience rather than indulgence. If you're waiting to feel wealthy before you believe progress is happening, you'll miss it entirely. There's one more detail people routinely overlook, and it matters a great deal. That $1.8 million figure applies to households, not individuals. A household might be one person, but very often it's two adults, sometimes with children, sometimes with other dependents. When individuals compare themselves to a household number, they're holding themselves to a standard that's artificially high. Mentally adjusting for that doesn't make the goal trivial, but it does make it honest. And honesty matters if you want to think clearly. I've always believed that clear thinking begins with refusing to be intimidated by numbers. Numbers are tools. They describe reality. They don't pass judgment on you. When people let a number shut down their curiosity, they give up the most valuable asset they have, the ability to reason their way forward. The real tragedy isn't that most people never reach the top 10%. It's that many of them never even try to understand what it would actually take, because they quit the moment the number makes them uncomfortable. One of the most persistent errors in human thinking is the tendency to judge reality by its most visible examples. People look for the loudest signals, the most obvious markers, and then assume that's what the whole system must look like. Wealth is a perfect example of this mistake. When most people imagine someone in the top 10% financially, they picture excess, big houses, new cars, obvious consumption, some kind of external proof that says this person has made it. And when they don't see those signals in their own lives, they conclude they must be far behind. That conclusion is almost always wrong. In practice, the kind of wealth that puts people into the top 10% is rarely dramatic and almost never theatrical. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly, often in places that feel boring and unimpressive while they're happening. A large portion of it, for example, sits in home equity. That fact alone disappoints people who are hoping for a more exciting explanation. Home equity doesn't feel clever. It doesn't feel like a victory. It just sits there, slowly growing as mortgages get paid down and property values inch upward over long stretches of time. Yet for many households, it ends up representing a third or even half of their total net worth. That's not because they made a brilliant real estate play. It's usually because they bought a reasonably priced home years earlier, lived in it for a long time, and didn't constantly reset the clock by upgrading every time their income increased. Time did most of the heavy lifting. Discipline merely stayed out of its way. The same is true of retirement accounts. People love to imagine that large balances come from extraordinary insight or perfect timing. In reality, most sizable retirement accounts are the result of repetition. Contributions made consistently, investments left alone, decades allowed to pass without interference. It's not exciting work. In fact, it's so unexciting that many people dismiss it entirely. They underestimate how powerful long periods of ordinary behavior can be when compounded. Then they're shocked when someone else's ordinary decisions add up to an extraordinary result. Another mistake people make is assuming that wealth must feel transformative from the inside. They expect a psychological shift, a moment where everything suddenly feels different. That rarely happens. For most people, crossing into the top 10% feels anticlimactic. Life looks largely the same. The grocery store doesn't change. The commute doesn't change. The problems don't vanish. What does change is something subtler and far more important: pressure. Expenses feel more manageable. Setbacks feel survivable. Decisions don't feel as rushed. That's what wealth actually buys: margin. But margin is quiet. It doesn't produce envy. And because it doesn't look impressive from the outside, people overlook it entirely. This misunderstanding leads to a dangerous comparison trap. People compare their behind-the-scenes reality to someone else's highlight reel and assume they're losing. In truth, many of the people they envy are running systems with far less resilience than their own. High income paired with high fixed costs is not strength, it's fragility dressed up as success. Another overlooked aspect is how spread out real wealth tends to be. People imagine a single dominant account doing all the work. In reality, net worth is usually fragmented across multiple categories: a house, retirement savings, taxable investments, cash reserves, perhaps a small business or side asset. No single piece looks extraordinary on its own. It's the combination that matters. This fragmentation is part of why wealth is so easy to misjudge. You don't see someone's retirement account when you meet them. You don't see their mortgage balance. You don't see how long they've owned their assets or how little they owe relative to what they own. You see consumption, which is often the least informative data point available. The irony is that the people who consume the least conspicuously often have the strongest balance sheets. They're not trying to signal success. They're trying to preserve optionality. And optionality, having choices without urgency, is a far better indicator of financial health than any visible luxury. There's also a timing element people misunderstand. Wealth tends to be backloaded. Progress is slow and unimpressive for a long time, then accelerates later. That creates the illusion that some people suddenly became wealthy. In reality, the groundwork was laid quietly over many years while nobody was paying attention. Most people give up during the unimpressive phase. They mistake slow progress for no progress. They conclude the system isn't working because it hasn't produced a dramatic payoff yet. That impatience is one of the primary reasons they never reach the outcomes they admire in others. I've always found it telling that people want the rewards of long-term discipline without the appearance of long-term discipline. They want the outcome to look exciting, even if the process never is. But reality doesn't negotiate on those terms. If you strip away the myths, what remains is almost disappointingly simple. The top 10% isn't populated by people who cracked a secret code. It's populated by people whose financial lives look unremarkable on the surface and structurally sound underneath. Once you understand that, a great deal of confusion disappears. The goal stops looking mythical and starts looking mechanical. And when something becomes mechanical, it becomes something you can reason about instead of fear. That's the moment when progress actually becomes possible. After watching financial outcomes for decades, I've come to a conclusion that surprises people the first time they hear it. Almost no one fails financially because of a series of small mistakes. That's not how it usually happens. People fail because of one or two large decisions that permanently damage their trajectory. Small errors are normal. They're inevitable. You buy the wrong car once. You make an investment that doesn't work. You misjudge a purchase or overestimate a return. None of that is fatal. Those mistakes slow you down, but they don't end the story. Given enough time and reasonable behavior afterward, they fade into insignificance. The real damage comes from mistakes that don't merely reduce progress, but erase accumulated progress altogether. That distinction matters more than most people realize. One of the most common examples is a poorly handled divorce. I'm not talking about the emotional side of it that's outside my competence. I'm talking about the financial mechanics. Assets get split, legal fees pile up, housing costs often increase instead of decrease, fixed expenses rise overnight, years, sometimes decades, of steady accumulation can vanish in a very short period of time. And once that reset happens, rebuilding is far more difficult, both financially and psychologically. Another frequent culprit is persistent lifestyle inflation. As income rises, spending expands right alongside it. Cars get upgraded, homes get larger, commitments multiply. On paper, income looks strong. In reality, there's no margin. Nothing compounds, because nothing is left over long enough to matter. This is how people earning excellent incomes end up with fragile financial systems. They look successful, but they're one interruption away from serious trouble. And fragility is the opposite of wealth, no matter how impressive it appears from the outside. Then there's leverage used carelessly or at the wrong scale. Borrowing heavily to chase returns can feel intelligent when things go well. When they don't, leverage has a brutal way of compressing years of effort into a single bad outcome. A business that fails after being financed aggressively, a speculative investment funded with borrowed money, a real estate deal that depended on optimistic assumptions continuing indefinitely. These are not small setbacks. These are career-level financial injuries. I want to be very clear here. This is not an argument for avoiding risk altogether. That would be foolish. You cannot build meaningful wealth without taking risk. Investing is a risk. Starting a business is a risk. Buying a home is a risk. Even choosing a career path is a risk. The issue is not whether you take risks. The issue is what happens if you're wrong. Good risks have manageable downside. If they fail, you're inconvenienced, not destroyed. You learn, adjust, and continue. Bad risks wipe the slate clean. They force you to start over from a position of weakness, often at a stage of life where time is no longer an ally. People who end up in the top 10% are not people who avoided risk. They're people who were disciplined about limiting irreversible damage. They understood, intuitively or explicitly, that staying in the game matters more than swinging for the fences. This is where restraint becomes more important than brilliance. You don't need 10 great decisions to build substantial wealth. You don't even need 5. What you need is to avoid the one decision that makes all the previous ones irrelevant. That's a much lower bar, but it requires something most people struggle with: patience and humility. Humility, to accept that you don't need to prove anything with your financial life. Patience to let progress accumulate slowly without demanding constant excitement or validation. When you look closely at households that reach the top 10%, a consistent pattern emerges. They stayed employed most of the time. They kept fixed costs under control. They avoided obligations that boxed them into corners. They didn't confuse optimism with safety. And when opportunities arose, they evaluated them not only by potential upside, but by worst-case consequences. That last part is crucial. Most people ask, how much can I make if this works? Very few ask, what does my life look like if this goes wrong? The second question is far more predictive of long-term success. I've always believed that intelligence shows up more clearly in what people refuse to do than in what they choose to pursue. Saying no to a bad risk often looks like inaction. In reality, it's a highly active form of self-preservation. The tragedy is that these lessons are rarely taught explicitly. People learn them backward by watching others fall, or worse, by falling themselves. And once a major setback occurs, the climb back is steep enough that many never attempt it again. That's why so many people never reach the financial position they once thought was possible. Not because they lacked opportunity, but because they stepped on a landmine that permanently altered their path. Avoiding those landmines doesn't guarantee success, but stepping on one almost guarantees failure. And that, more than any clever strategy, explains why the field thins out so dramatically over time. By the time people reach the later stages of their financial lives, many of them are surprised by something they never expected. The number itself matters far less than they thought it would. Net worth is a useful measurement, but it's a blunt one. It tells you where someone stands at a single moment in time and almost nothing about how secure that position really is. Two people can have identical balance sheets and completely different financial lives. One feels calm, the other feels trapped. That difference has very little to do with the headline number. What matters far more is how resilient the system is. I've always found that a better way to judge financial health is to look at how life behaves under stress. When something goes wrong, and something always does it register as an inconvenience or a crisis? If your car needs a major repair, do you grumble and move on, or does it trigger weeks of anxiety? If income drops temporarily, does your life tighten a bit, or does it start to unravel? Those reactions tell you far more than a net worth statement ever could. Real wealth provides breathing room. It slows life down. Decisions stop feeling urgent. You gain the ability to say no, not just to bad opportunities, but to unnecessary stress. That freedom is subtle, which is why it's often misunderstood. It doesn't come with applause, but it changes how you experience almost everything. One of the great illusions people carry is that wealth is about consumption. In reality, it's about control. Control over your time, control over your reactions, control over which risks you take and which ones you avoid. The people who truly have this control rarely talk about it, because there's nothing performative about it. This is also why people can feel behind even when they're doing reasonably well. They compare themselves to a static number without context. They see a percentile ranking and treat it like a judgment rather than a snapshot. But financial life is not a photograph. It's a moving system. Momentum matters, direction matters, stability matters. Someone with a lower net worth but modest expenses, consistent savings, and room to adapt is often in a far stronger position than someone with a higher number built on fragile assumptions. High fixed costs, tight margins, and dependence on uninterrupted income can turn impressive-looking finances into a source of constant pressure. Another useful lens is to look at where progress is coming from. Early on, nearly all progress comes from work more hours, better jobs, higher pay. That's normal. But over time, a healthy system begins to change its character. Assets start to contribute meaningfully, not dramatically, but noticeably. Growth becomes less dependent on constant effort. This shift doesn't require extreme wealth. It requires consistency and time. And once it begins, it changes how setbacks feel. You stop feeling like every problem must be solved with more effort. You start seeing alternatives. That's a powerful psychological transition, even if the numbers themselves don't look extraordinary yet. Most people underestimate how valuable that transition is. They focus on the destination and miss the fact that life often improves long before the destination is reached. Decisions feel lighter, stress decreases. Optionality expands. These are real benefits, even if no one else notices them. That's why I've never been particularly impressed by rankings or percentiles. They encourage comparison without understanding. They reduce complex financial lives to a single metric and invite people to draw the wrong conclusions from it. Being in the top 10% doesn't tell you how someone got there. It doesn't tell you what risks they're carrying, and it certainly doesn't tell you where they're headed next. It's not a story. It's a frame from the middle of a much longer film. The uncomfortable truth is that 90% of people will never reach that point, not because it's unreachable, but because they never build a system sturdy enough to stay intact over time. They chase speed instead of durability, excitement instead of margin, appearances instead of structure. The people who do make it rarely feel exceptional while they're doing it. They're not constantly optimizing or chasing brilliance. They're protecting downside. They're keeping their lives flexible. They're giving time a chance to work on their behalf. That's the part people don't want to hear, because it's not glamorous, but it's reliable. And in the end, reliability beats brilliance far more often than anyone likes to admit.